One of the things about George Washington, he's a man of tremendous wisdom. He's not a brilliant man. Thomas Jefferson is a brilliant man. Alexander Hamilton is a brilliant man. James Madison is a brilliant man. Washington was not. But he was able to use what somebody called the rays of genius of others. He said, "Mine's far abler than my own." And Washington wanted to draw on the expertise of people who knew more than he.
We've never had a Secretary of Treasury as brilliant as Alexander Hamilton. No one has had a Secretary of State with the kind of sparkling intellect of Thomas Jefferson. And it was natural that men like this would find places where they clashed with one another. It was Washington's gift for most of his administration to be able to manage these passionate men and to get the best out of them.
Fundamental differences between Jefferson and Hamilton are huge personality differences and very different upbringings. But the bottom line difference is region. And we forget that in that time, at the time of the writing of the Constitution and the early Republic, that when people referred to my country, they meant their state. George Washington was able to use them both as advisors initially, and it worked for him. He understood that he needed to bring these various forces together, and these were both prominent and very brilliant men. But in the end, it didn't work. In the end, Jefferson really didn't agree with the direction that the Washington administration was heading in, and he departed from the cabinet.
I think George Washington had strong relationships with a lot of people over the course of his life, and certainly one of the images that gets passed down about Washington was that he was very formal. He was not the kind of guy that you come up and slap on the back. Those relationships were earned, and so he had this very strong sense of who he was. Now, that didn't mean that he couldn't have close relationships, and he did with many men, especially those who served with him during the war. I think for Washington, the Revolution was really a defining event. And so his officers, folks like Hamilton, Henry Knox that he served with, they just occupied a place in his life that nobody else was going to occupy. And the same, I think, goes for Billy Lee, who was his personal slave, served with him through 8 years of war. Obviously served in a relationship that was very different from the one that he had with Alexander Hamilton or Henry Knox, but nevertheless an important one. And just having gone through that experience, I think meant that relationship was going to be a very special one for Washington.
James Madison and George Washington were almost 20 years apart in age, with Madison being the junior. Nevertheless, they developed a very close relationship because in the 80s, they shared the same concerns for America and shared the same goals. And throughout his life, Madison had nothing but the utmost respect for Washington. He knew he was the most trusted and revered man in America, and he shared those feelings. At the same time, he felt that Washington, in charting the course of his administration, had simply been led astray and pulled too much toward England, and he really blamed others, advisors like Alexander Hamilton, for Washington following that path. It did lead to a breach between the two men, but it never diminished Madison's respect for George Washington.
Mason is the forgotten founder because he was on the wrong side of history. I think this is a great example of the winners writing history. Mason stood for a 1770s version of the Constitution, where power was decentralized to the states. Mason was stuck in the 70s, and he lost out to a 1780s version of the American Revolution, where power is centralized in a federal government with a strong executive. And so because he lost, I think he becomes forgotten in history.
His rupture with Washington definitely isolated him. He was also isolated from many other people of prominence. And because of his refusal to sign, he was perceived negatively, and that diminished his reputation.
Without George Mason, either you don't have the following things, or you don't have them in the form we know them today. the Virginia Declaration of Rights of 1776, the Virginia Constitution of 1776, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, the Constitutional Convention, the Constitution as we know it, and the Federal Bill of Rights of 1791. And so if that doesn't qualify the man as a founder, I don't know what does.
Washington's farewell address is remembered in history because it set modest aspirations for the president and the nation, which I think are goals that we feel the need to return to on a regular basis, even though they're very lofty aspirations.
Washington's vision for the United States was, on the one hand, a continental vision. It included all of the different peoples who made up this young country, from north to south to east to west. It incorporated the settlers, it incorporated Native Americans, it incorporated everybody. And so it was truly a unified vision. Washington preached again and again how important union was, how important unity of purpose was. And that was the great thrust of the farewell address. Union. Union is everything. At the same time, Washington had a vision for domestic policy and for foreign policy. And the basis of that vision was sound, prudent management that was based on a realistic view of what this country could achieve, but that was also based on an idealistic view of everything that this nation could become. Washington believed above all that Americans need to avoid petty jealousies, they need to avoid emotional judgments, they need to avoid passions, and they need to balance themselves. They need to balance all of their feelings, they need to balance all of their ideas in a unified vision for a great common goal.